General George Patton wrote a poem in which he swore he had once been a Roman legionary, a spearman in Caesar's line, dead on a Gallic field 2,000 years before he was born. He meant it, not as a figure of speech. He believed it the way you believe you remember your own childhood. And the strangest part is this: the man who set that claim down on paper had spent his own childhood unable to read a single line for himself. The boy could not read. He was 11 years old, the son of a wealthy California family, and he could not make the letters hold still on the page. We would call it dyslexia now. In 1896 there was no word for it, only the suspicion among the household that the child was slow. He was not slow, he simply could not read. So they read to him. His father, his aunt, the men of the family, they sat in the long room of the ranch at Lake Vineyard and read aloud, and the boy listened, and what he heard, he kept. He kept all of it. The Iliad in Pope's translation, Caesar's account of the Gallic War and the siege of Alesia. Plutarch, 2 lives at a sitting. The boy who could not read a single line for himself could recite, by the time he was 12, long passages of Homer from memory, and he did it in the cadence of a man who had heard them spoken rather than seen them printed. There is a difference. A man who reads a war story sees it on paper. A man who has it read to him again and again hears it the way the first audiences heard it, as something happening in a room, out loud, to people who are present. This is the first thing to understand about George Patton. He came to the ancient world through the ear, not the eye. He never quite stopped hearing it. And one day, on a hill outside Carthage, he would stand on the bare ground and tell his staff in plain words that he had been there before. 58 years old. A general now, 3 stars, the most aggressive field commander the American army had produced in that war, with maybe a year of his life left and no way of knowing it. He sat down. We do not know the exact date, the manuscript is undated, and the editors of his papers have argued about it, and he wrote the poem. He had written poems all his life, bad ones mostly. He knew they were bad. He kept writing them. This one is not bad, or rather, its badness does not matter, because the poem is not trying to be good. It is trying to say a thing he believed and could not say any other way. The poem is called Through a Glass Darkly. The title is from Paul, 1 Corinthians, the passage about seeing now through a glass darkly and then face to face. Patton did not pick that title for its piety. He picked it because it described, exactly, the way he experienced his own past. The poem says that he has lived before, not as a figure of speech. The poem says it plainly, in the first person, line after line. He had been a legionary. He had been there at the sack of cities he had never, in this life, seen. He had carried a spear and stood in a shield wall and died on fields whose names he knew before anyone told him. I read this poem the first time, many years ago, expecting a curiosity, a general's hobby. It is not that. It is a sworn statement. Here is the man on the other side of 2,000 years. Not one man, many, because Patton believed he had been many. But the one that mattered most to him, the one he returned to in the poem and in his letters and in the things he said aloud to his staff when he thought the moment warranted it, was a soldier of Rome, a ranker. Not Caesar. Patton never claimed to have been Caesar, which tells you something about him, because a vain man inventing past lives would have made himself a king. Patton made himself a spearman in the line. He had heard read, the 7th book of the Gallic War, the siege of Alesia, the double ring of fortifications Caesar threw up around the Gallic stronghold, and then a second ring facing outward against the relief army. He knew that siege the way a man knows a street he grew up on, and somewhere in him was the conviction, immovable, that he knew it because he had been inside the ring. The historical record on this is not thin. That is what makes it strange. We are not reconstructing a rumor. The poem survives, in his own composition, published after his death in the collection his family released, and later in Martin Blumenson's edition of the Patton Papers. The letters survive. He wrote to his wife Beatrice about previous lives, more than once, in a tone that was not playful. The diary survives in the Library of Congress, and the diary does not joke about this. A man who jokes hedges. Patton did not hedge. He told his staff, on at least one recorded occasion, in plain declarative sentences, that he had stood on a particular piece of ground before, in another body, in another century. That occasion is where this story is going, but not yet. First, the poem, because the poem is the key to everything else, and because most people who have heard of George Patton, the ivory-handled revolver, the slapping incident, the speech to the Third Army, have never read 4 lines of it. They should. It is the most honest document he left, more honest than the diary, because the diary was written by a general who knew it might be read, and the poem was written by a boy who could not read, finally setting down the thing the books had put in him 40 years before. He believed he remembered Rome. He believed it the way you believe you remember your own childhood, not as theory, as memory. If the kind of history that takes a man at his own word, that asks not whether Patton was right about his past lives, but what it meant that he was certain of them, is the reason you are here, the small button below keeps this work going. That is the only time I will mention it. What did the poem actually say? It said, among much else, this: that he had been there when the legions held the wall, that he had heard the dying calling on their gods, that he had fought and bled in forms he could no longer name, but could still feel. It is written in long, rolling stanzas, archaic in diction, deliberately old-fashioned even for 1944. He was not writing for publication. He was writing for himself, in the only register that felt true to the size of the claim. You do not announce a belief in reincarnation in plain modern prose. You reach for something older because the thing you are saying is older than prose. And the line that matters most, the one I want you to hold, because it comes back at the end of this, is the line in which he places himself specifically in the ranks of Rome. Not watching Rome, in it. A man with a Latin gladius in his fist, in the heat and the dust and the noise, doing the work. He had carried that image since the ranch at Lake Vineyard, since the afternoons when he could not read and so was read to, and Caesar's Gallic war came into him through the ear and never left. He kept the commentaries with him in the field. The actual book, in Latin, in his kit, in 1944, while he was running an army across France along roads that Caesar's legions had marched 2,000 years before. He read the Latin. Slowly, he was always a slow reader, the dyslexia never left him, but he read it, and he read it where Caesar had fought, and the distance between the page and the ground outside his tent was, to George Patton, no distance at all. In the spring of 1943, before any of the poem's lines had been set down on paper, before France, before the Third Army, Patton was in North Africa, and his staff car turned off a road outside Tunis and climbed a low hill, and at the top of the hill there was almost nothing left to see. Some foundations, some scattered stone, the wind off the water. The hill had a name. The Romans had called it the Bursa. It was the citadel of Carthage, or what remained of it, more than 2,000 years after the last Carthaginian died defending it. Patton got out of the car. His staff got out behind him, and he stood on the hilltop and looked at the empty ground. And he was quiet for a long time, longer than his staff was used to. Then he began to speak. What he said is on the other side of that silence, and it is the reason this story exists. Leave the hill for a moment. We will come back to it. To understand what Patton said on the Bursa, you have to understand the cost of it, what it took for a man like him to believe a thing like that and survive in the United States Army while believing it. West Point nearly destroyed him. He failed mathematics in his first year and was held back, turned back, in the Academy's language, to repeat the whole of it. A full year lost. For a boy raised on Plutarch, on the lives of men who rose without faltering, the failure was not academic. It was metaphysical. He wrote home in a state that, if you read the letters now, reads close to despair. He drove himself the way the legions drove themselves on a forced march, past the point of sense, on into the dark, because stopping was the only thing he would not permit. He learned to ride until he fell, and then rode again. He set rifle records. He ran himself half to death on the cinder track. And the thing that kept him moving, the thing underneath the discipline, was not ambition in the ordinary sense. It was the conviction that he had done all this before, and done it well, and that this lifetime was a test of whether he could do it again. That is the engine of the poem. Through a glass darkly is not a daydream. It is the private theology of a man who needed, in order to function, to believe that his courage was older than his body. Read the stanzas, and you find no Caesar in them. This is the detail that stops me every time. A man inventing a glorious past for himself reaches for the crown. Patton reached for the ranks. The poem puts him among the nameless, the legionary who held the wall, the spearman who fell at some unrecorded gate, the soldier who heard, as he wrote, the dying call upon their gods. He saw himself, again and again, as the man who did the fighting, and not the man who ordered it. There is a humility in that, which sits oddly beside everything else we know about George Patton, the showman, the man with the ivory grips and the lacquered helmet. The poet underneath was a private soldier of Rome. He names the wars only obliquely. He had been, he wrote, a fighter in many forms across many ages, at Troy, in the legions, as a knight, as a Highlander, on into the gunpowder centuries. But the legion is the one he returns to, the one with the most heat in the lines, and any man who had spent his boyhood inside the 7th book of the Gallic War knew exactly which legion. Caesar's. The one that built the rings at Alesia. Here the ancient knot tightens, and I have to be careful, because the temptation is to make it tidier than the sources allow. In 52 before Christ, Caesar trapped the Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix inside the hill fort of Alesia. He could not storm it, so he built a ring of fortifications 11 miles around, facing inward to starve the town. And then, when he learned a Gallic relief army was coming, a second ring outside the first, facing the other way, longer than the inner one, so that his own men stood between two enemies, besiegers and besieged at once. It is one of the most audacious engineering decisions in the history of war. Caesar's own account of it, in the 7th book, is precise about the numbers. Modern historians disagree about whether the numbers can be trusted. Caesar was writing his own legend. The figures may be inflated. The double ring, though, the basic fact of the double ring, no one disputes. The earthworks have been excavated. The thing was real. And inside that ring stood the legionaries, the men Patton believed he had been. They dug for weeks. They fought on 2 fronts in the same hour when the relief came. They held. Caesar, in his commentaries, gives the credit, as commanders do, to his own design and his own nerve. But the men in the ditches were the ones who held it, and Patton, slow reading the Latin in his tent in 1944, on French ground, not far from where some of this had happened, read the 7th book not as Caesar's triumph, but as theirs, as his. He had been in the ditch, he was sure of it. Now turn the page 2,000 years. The same kind of moment came to Patton in the body he was wearing in this life. France, the late summer of 1944. His Third Army was tearing east faster than any American force in the war, and then it stopped. Not because the Germans stopped it, but because the fuel did. The decision had been made above him, at the level of Eisenhower and the supply planners, to send the gasoline north to Montgomery's Drive instead of east to Patton's. Patton was certain, then and after, that he could have ended the war that autumn if they had let him run. He said so. He said it to anyone who would listen, and several who would rather not. He believed, exactly as a Roman legate cut off by the Senate's politics might have believed, that the men with the real understanding of the war were in the field, and the men making the decisions were in the rear, and that the rear was about to lose what the field had won. He wrote about it. The diary from that stretch is angry. The handwriting in some entries is heavier than usual. He bore down on the pen. He thought he was watching a victory thrown away by committee, and the Roman parallel was not something a historian imposed on him afterward. He drew it himself, in his own words, comparing the timidity of his superiors to the failures of nerve that had cost Rome its chances in this campaign or that. He had the whole sweep of it in his head. He could reach for a precedent from the 2nd century before Christ, the way another general might reach for one from the last war. 2 men, 2,000 years between them, one in a ditch at Alesia, holding a line he did not design, and one in a command tent in Lorraine, watching a line he had designed go cold for want of fuel. Same conviction in both, that the fighting men understood the war and the men behind them did not. Patton would not have called these 2 men a parallel. He would have called them the same man, himself, twice. He confessed it most plainly not to his staff and not to his diary, but to his wife. The letters to Beatrice are where the belief is at its least guarded. He told her he had been a soldier before, in other ages. He told her this not as a man sharing a curiosity, but as a husband telling a wife a true thing about himself that he could not tell anyone else. Whether she believed him, we do not fully know. Her side of the correspondence is less complete. But he meant it. The letters are not the letters of a man performing a quirk for an audience. They are too quiet for that. They are the letters of a man who had carried a secret since boyhood and had exactly one person he could say it to. And there was a thing he did not yet know, in 1944, writing his poem and his angry diary and his letters home. He did not know how little time was left. Not on the battlefield. He would survive the war. He did not know that the body he believed he had worn so many times before had, in this life, just over a year left to wear. The poem about returning was, though he could not have known it, very nearly the last word of the man who had returned. The Bursar, spring of 1943. He turned to his staff and he started talking, and the men around him understood very quickly that he was not giving them a history lecture. He told them what had happened on this hill. The Carthaginians, he said, had defended the city against 3 Roman legions. They were proud. They were brave. They could not hold. The legions came up the slope, and the city fell, and the people who had lived here were killed or sold, and the ground his boots were standing on had been 2,000 years before the last high place of a dying nation. The staff officers had heard Patton talk about the ancient world before. They were used to it. This was different. He was not telling them a story about other people. The sentences kept sliding into the first person. He had been here. He said it in those words, or close to them. The staff accounts differ slightly in the exact phrasing, the way accounts always do when men are remembering something that unsettled them. The core of it does not vary.